Hello, everyone. In this session, we're going to talk about communication in the modern workplace. Communication is not just the exchange of information, it is also how we create relationships, build trust, coordinate work, and make sense of what is happening around us. A good starting point is recognizing that workplace communication has been changing quickly. Collaborative work is not new, but the tools and expectations around communication changed dramatically. Many teams now rely on inexpensive, user friendly technologies that allow people to coordinate across distance and time. At the same time, the sheer volume of communication options can feel overwhelming. You can speak face to face, call, text, email, chat, video conference, collaborate inside platforms, share documents, leave voice notes, use project boards, and communicate through social media. All of this raises a serious question. Are we actually communicating more effectively and efficiently, or are we simply communicating more often? Some people argue that technology improves productivity, idea generation, engagement, and speed of decision making. Others argue that it creates stress, interruptions, overload, and even new pathways for harassment and bullying. Hold both these realities in view. Let's think strategically about communication rather than just reacting to it. Let's begin with interpersonal communication. Most people immediately think of oral communication. Speaking is fast, expressive, and often emotionally rich. But even oral communication comes in different forms, depending on whether it is synchronous or asynchronous. Synchronicity means both the sender and receiver are present, aware, and focused on the exchange. A live conversation is synchronous. A real time meeting is synchronous. A phone call is typically synchronous. In contrast, asynchronous communication happens when the message is received outside a shared moment of presence. Think of a recorded video message from leadership or an update posted to employees that they read later. Asynchrony can increase reach and reduce scheduling pressure, but it can also reduce immediate feedback and mutual adjustment, which matter a great deal in situations that are emotionally sensitive or ambiguous. Now let's talk about conversations and discussions, because not all conversation is the same, and not all conversation is welcome. People often avoid conversations they expect will lead to conflict or that feel like an invasion of privacy. At the same time, conversations strongly shape how people take in information, how they remember it, and how they interpret the environment. Conversations can cause people to recall some things and forget others, and they can create a subtle effect called audience tuning, where people frame information differently depending on who they're speaking to. That is not always dishonest. Often, it's an adaptive way of fitting the message to the listener. But it does mean that conversations actively shape the reality people walk away with. One of the major disadvantages of oral communication shows up when a message has to pass through multiple people. Every time the message is repeated, the potential for distortion increases. This is one reason why rumors spread so easily and why organizations sometimes lose control of narratives. You can also think of this as a reason for careful communication design. When accuracy matters and the message will travel, you want a structure that reduces distortion. At this point, it becomes obvious that listening is not optional, it is central. Listening is not merely hearing words. Effective listening means actively sensing and processing what the other person is communicating, including subtle cues, and responding in a way that shows you are engaged and present. Active listening involves attention and responsive engagement. Reflective listening goes one step further, acknowledging, restating, or reformulating someone else's message in a non judgmental way to encourage them to elaborate and to feel understood. Reflective listening is powerful because it reduces defensiveness and increases clarity, and it's a foundational skill for leadership, conflict management, and coaching. Meetings are a special form of oral communication, and they are also one of the most complained about features of organizational life. Meetings are essentially formal discussions involving two or more people, and they can occur anywhere, including virtually. Many employees report that wasteful meetings and unexpected meetings are among the biggest obstacles to getting work done. Yet at the same time, they often rate meetings as one of the most effective communication channels available. That seems contradictory until you recognize what meetings can do when they are well designed. They synchronize understanding, align goals, and resolve ambiguity quickly. But meetings can also become a space where time is consumed without outcomes, where attention is fragmented, and where people perform competence rather than produce value. One of the most useful insights for modern work is that effective virtual teams often work in bursts. They meet to coordinate and align, then they move into longer blocks of uninterrupted deep work. This pattern recognizes something fundamental. Communication is essential, but constant communication is not. It also reminds us that the interpersonal dynamics inside meetings matter. For example, research shows that when meetings start late, participants' satisfaction drops, their perceptions of effectiveness drop, creativity during the meeting suffers, and relational conflict can increase. That is not just a pet peeve, it's a measurable organizational behavior effect. So, meeting discipline, starting and ending on time, is not an etiquette issue, it is a performance issue. If you want meetings to be better, the core principle is intentionality. Meet only when a meeting is truly needed. Gather input from participants beforehand so the meeting can focus on decisions and alignment rather than collecting basic information. Provide an agenda so people can prepare and so the meeting has direction. Delegate roles, because meetings often fail when no one owns facilitation, timekeeping, documentation, or next steps. Limit distractions, because attention is the currency of meetings. And start and end on time to preserve trust and efficiency. These steps sound simple, but they represent a mature understanding of meetings as a designed communication system rather than a default habit. Speeches are another major form of oral communication, and it's worth taking them seriously. Leaders use speeches to influence meaning, motivation, and collective understanding. A speech is not just content, it's framing. It shapes what people think is happening, why it matters, and what should be done. In organizations, speeches can mobilize people around a purpose, reduce uncertainty in times of change, and signal values. That's why speeches are a classic tool in leadership communication. Now let's shift into written communication. Written communication includes things like memos, letters, email, instant messaging, periodicals, and any method that conveys written words or symbols. We often assume oral communication is superior because it feels richer, but modern remote and distributed teams can be effective even when they rely heavily on writing. Writing has a major advantage. It creates a record, it can be reread, and it can travel with less distortion. Writing also forces a certain discipline of thought, because you have to choose words carefully and structure meaning. But written communication also has weaknesses. It can be misunderstood without nonverbal cues, it can feel colder, and it can invite overinterpretation of tone. Email is the most dominant form of written communication in modern organizations, and that dominance creates a paradox. Email is so pervasive that it's hard to imagine work without it, but it also consumes enormous amounts of time and can become a productivity sink. Many employees spend hours each day checking email, and many managers report they spend far too much time on it. This matters because time spent monitoring and processing messages is time not spent doing deep work. It also matters because email can carry incivility in a way that is easy to underestimate. People can be passively rude, actively rude, or simply careless in ways that create emotional costs for the receiver. Email incivility can reduce engagement and energy and can harm performance. So the question becomes, how do we handle the constant flow of written messages without becoming overwhelmed? The big idea is that email should not function like an always-on conversation channel. It should be managed like a workflow. That means controlling notifications, rather than letting notifications control you. It means checking email at regular intervals rather than constantly. It means moving messages out of the inbox after reading, using search and filters effectively, using a small number of folders or tags for retrieval, and treating less important emails in batches rather than giving each message a full emotional and cognitive response. It also means being thoughtful about reply all, because every unnecessary reply all multiplies communication load across the organization. And it means thinking before you send, because email creates permanent records, and a message written in frustration can create long term relational damage. Instant messaging and text messaging are now central in many workplaces, and they bring a different norm: immediacy. With texts and chat messages, recipients are often expected to respond quickly, in a brief conversational manner. That expectation can make communication feel faster, but it can also increase interruptions and fragmentation. It can create a culture where people feel constantly on, which can raise stress and make deep work difficult. It also changes emotional dynamics. People with lower agreeableness and lower emotional stability are more likely to use negative emotion words in texts and chats, and that emotional tone can shape the mood and productivity of the receiver. So the medium is not neutral, it shapes behavior. This is why employees and leaders need to be cautious about over-relying on instant messaging for complex or emotionally sensitive topics. Now we need to talk about nonverbal communication, because every verbal message carries a nonverbal component. Sometimes the nonverbal component even stands alone. Nonverbal communication includes body movements, facial expressions, tone and emphasis, and physical distance. Here's the key: people make strong and consistent attributions based on nonverbal cues, even when those attributions are wrong. So, nonverbal communication is powerful, but it is not always accurate as a signal. That means we have two responsibilities. We need to manage our own nonverbal signals deliberately, and we also need to interpret others' nonverbal cues carefully, without overconfidence. Body language can convey status, engagement, and emotion. Some movements are conscious, many are automatic. But either way, others are interpreting them. We also communicate through sensory cues, such as vocal tone, pacing, and what is sometimes called paralanguage. Even smell can function as symbolic communication in the workplace, triggering emotions and signaling routines. Touch is another powerful channel, though in organizations it must be used cautiously and ethically. In appropriate contexts, touch can communicate support and warmth, and even increase cooperative intent, but norms vary widely by culture and by workplace. Physical space and time also communicate. How close we stand to someone, how quickly we move, whether we rush or linger, whether we are early or late. These cues shape how others interpret us and how relationships develop. In virtual contexts, these nonverbal channels are partly replaced by camera framing, eye contact through a lens, voice quality, timing, and responsiveness. So even when the channel changes, nonverbal communication doesn't disappear. It transforms. Now we need to talk about nonverbal communication, because every verbal message carries a nonverbal component. Sometimes the nonverbal component even stands alone. Nonverbal communication includes body movements, facial expressions, tone and emphasis, and physical distance. Here's the key: people make strong and consistent attributions based on nonverbal cues, even when those attributions are wrong. So, nonverbal communication is powerful, but it is not always accurate as a signal. That means we have two responsibilities. We need to manage our own nonverbal signals deliberately, and we also need to interpret others' nonverbal cues carefully, without overconfidence. This brings us to a practical challenge: choosing communication methods. The central principle is to match the method to the content of the message and to choose a channel with the fewest barriers to effective communication. That means you consider whether the message is complex, emotionally sensitive, ambiguous, urgent, confidential, or likely to be misunderstood. It also means you consider whether people need to be psychologically present at the same time, which brings us back to synchronicity. Some messages require real-time adjustment and feedback, others do not. Media richness. Theory gives you a clean way to make that channel choice. Different media vary in how much meaning they can carry, so the more ambiguous, emotionally sensitive, or high-stakes a message is, the richer the channel you usually need. Rich channels allow rapid back and forth and multiple cues, like tone and facial expression, which is why face-to-face is typically the richest, followed by video and phone, while chat, email, and formal documents are leaner and easier to misread. The trick is that richer isn't always better. Lean channels can be ideal for routine updates, clear instructions, and anything that benefits from a record. So a strong default is to use rich communication to converge on shared meaning when interpretation is the problem, and then use a lean follow-up message to document what was decided, who owns what, and what happens next. Now let's focus on barriers to effective communication, because even if we choose a method well, communication can still fail. Three important barriers are information overload, communication apprehension, and communication during crisis. Information overload occurs when the inflow of information exceeds our processing capacity. When that happens, we don't simply process slower. We start selecting, ignoring, forgetting, and misprioritizing. We may skim and miss key details. We may become more reactive and less thoughtful. In modern work, overload is often intensified by multi-communication, which is the pressure to interact with multiple people simultaneously. Multi-communication can make people inadvertently rude, and it can trigger escalation because others interpret divided attention as disrespect or disengagement. If you want to reduce overload, the most important levers are reducing ambiguity and complexity and increasing relevance, because those characteristics are strongly connected to overload. It can also mean connecting to technology less frequently or at specified times, not as a lifestyle philosophy, but as a cognitive strategy. Communication apprehension is different. It happens when people experience anxiety or tension about communicating with others. This can stem from personality, past experiences, or fear of evaluation. But in modern organizations, it can also come from reluctance to use new media that someone isn't comfortable with. This matters because communication apprehension can reduce the amount of electronic communication a person engages in, and that can affect visibility and leadership emergence. One study found that communication apprehension reduced electronic communication, which, in turn, reduced the extent to which the person emerged as a team leader in others' eyes. In other words, communication apprehension can have career and leadership consequences, especially in environments where communication is central to coordination and influence. Communication becomes especially challenging in times of crisis. During crises, uncertainty rises, stakes rise, time pressure rises, emotions rise, and coordination demands rise. Effective crisis communication is not just a single event, it unfolds across stages. It involves communication before a crisis, communication during a crisis, and communication after a crisis in order to support learning. When crises hit, effective messaging that separates facts, interpretations, and projections can help people make sense of what's happening. Motivations may shift toward power or responsibility, which can either help or harm coordination. People may try to take control, blame others, or protect themselves. This is why work together rather than independently becomes such an important principle during crisis. Technology can help distribute accurate information quickly, including to people who may be imminently affected. But technology alone does not solve meaning making, it supports it. Now let's talk about advancements in virtual communication and why the concept of channel richness matters. As previously explained in the media richness theory, Channel richness is the amount of information that can be transmitted during a communication episode. Rich channels can handle multiple cues at once, facilitate rapid feedback, and feel personal. Face to face communication is typically the richest because it includes words, tone, posture, facial expressions, gestures, and immediate feedback, plus the personal presence of being together. Many modern virtual media are relatively rich: video conferencing, podcasting, vlogging, and collaborative tools, because they can approximate some features of in person interaction. But even rich media have trade offs. Video can create fatigue, chat can create interruptions, collaboration tools can create constant visibility and performance pressure. So again, the goal is not to pick the best channel universally, but to pick the channel that fits the message and the context. Video conferencing deserves special attention because it has become central in many organizations. Video conferencing helps build teams across geography, create community, train large groups, and host town halls. But to use it effectively, people need to be mindful of nonverbal behavior, set the stage, stay aware of other people on the call, test technology, and manage fatigue. Fatigue is real because video demands sustained attention, reduces natural movement, increases self monitoring, and can distort turn taking cues. Organizations that treat video conferencing as a free substitute for in person communication often underestimate these cognitive and emotional costs. Blogging, vlogging, and podcasting represent another shift in organizational communication. Blogs are written platforms that can share content and enable engagement, and their success often depends on making content searchable and engaging. Vlogging conveys similar functions through video and can be particularly useful when products require demonstration, instruction, or proficiency. Podcasts serve as audio content that often emphasizes storytelling and in-depth discussion, functioning like mini radio shows. What all these formats share is that they can scale communication beyond the limits of synchronous time and place, which is increasingly valuable in large organizations and distributed workforces. E-collaboration and e-learning tools also reshape organizational communication. Many businesses use platforms like Microsoft Teams and Google Workspace to coordinate projects and maintain shared documents. In online collaboration, leadership often becomes more salient because physical cues are reduced, so people look more actively for structure and direction. Research also suggests that effective e-collaboration requires motivation, knowledge, attentiveness, and composure. And these systems should be monitored, not in a surveillance sense, but in a coordination sense. People need to be communicating frequently and with quality, otherwise, collaboration becomes superficial. E-learning can be equally effective under the right conditions, especially when systems are well designed and support autonomy, collaboration, and feedback. Now let's address something that is easy to dismiss but actually matters: the currency of virtual communication. In virtual contexts, people often communicate in pictures, not just words. Emojis, GIFs, memes, abbreviations, usernames, and selfies become meaningful social signals. Research suggests that many users regularly use emojis, and that usage varies by age, gender, and personality. Yet these symbols can also create misunderstanding across cultures and generations. Interestingly, studies also show that people make personality judgments from usernames, but those judgments can be inaccurate, while personality judgments from selfies can be more accurate in some respects, though still imperfect. The larger point is that in virtual contexts, identity cues shift, and people constantly interpret signals, often with high confidence and limited accuracy. That has implications for impression management, bias, inclusion, and team dynamics. This leads into smartphones, social media, and cybersecurity, three issues that now shape communication in organizations at a systemic level. Smartphones have become nearly universal tools for work, and they create a constant connection that people often interpret as autonomy. You can work anywhere, anytime. But the paradox is that constant connection can strip autonomy away because it becomes difficult to disengage. The temptation of constant connectedness can even reduce enjoyment of in person interactions, and smartphone use can inhibit recovery activities at the end of the day, which are essential for preventing strain and burnout. Some people adapt by integrating technology into roles strategically, but many drift into an always on mode without realizing the costs. Other smart devices add further complexity. Voice activated assistants and smart home systems blur boundaries between personal and professional environments. Wearables and sensors like smartwatches can potentially track performance and help teams coordinate by signaling when someone might need support. These tools are full of promise, but they also raise ethical concerns about privacy, consent, and the potential normalization of surveillance. Social media is another double edged sword. Organizations use social media strategically to capture attention, convey information, mobilize stakeholders, direct information flow, and build brand identity. Employees use social media to connect, collaborate, network, search for jobs, and sometimes speak out about injustice or unfairness. Internal social platforms can encourage collaboration and improve training. But social media also produces a tension between employees' desire to speak authentically and organizations' desire to protect reputation and control information. Because content is public and hard to manage, many organizations adopt restrictive policies, which can limit employee freedoms. The bigger OB question is not simply, is social media good or bad, but rather, what are the psychological and organizational conditions under which social media supports well being, identity, and constructive voice, versus conditions under which it produces comparison, alienation, conflict, and reputational risk? Personality also shows up strongly on social media. Research suggests people can often infer traits like agreeableness, extroversion, and emotional stability from posts with some accuracy. Extroverted people tend to have more friends or followers, and their networks may be more interconnected. Narcissistic traits have been linked to more frequent status updates and self-presentational activity, especially when oriented toward social comparison or gaining new connections. The point is that online behavior is not random. It reflects stable tendencies and social motivations, and it becomes part of how people are perceived in professional contexts. Finally, cybersecurity is now a core organizational concern. Organizations have to protect sensitive information, customer data, patient data, employee data, intellectual property, strategic plans, and sometimes physical records as well. Employees are also concerned with their own privacy, especially as data breaches become common. Many companies monitor internet use and email records, and some even record phone conversations and use surveillance technologies. From a management perspective, cybersecurity protection requires understanding threats, building a culture that values cybersecurity, and adapting continuously because threats evolve. What matters is that communication technology creates vulnerability. The more connected the system is, the more paths exist for breaches and misuse. So cybersecurity is partly a technical issue, but it is also a behavioral issue and a cultural issue. Now let's close with cultural factors and cross-cultural communication, because communication is hard even within one cultural frame, and it becomes more complex across cultures. A gesture that is acceptable in one culture can be meaningless or offensive in another. Language itself is a challenge, and it's not just vocabulary. Cultures differ in how much context shapes meaning. In high-context cultures, meaning relies heavily on nonverbal cues and situational understanding, and communication implies a higher level of trust. Oral agreements may carry strong commitment. Status, age, and seniority can heavily influence credibility. In low-context cultures, meaning is more directly encoded in words, and people rely more on explicit spoken and written messages. Formal titles and body language may matter less in interpreting meaning than in high-context cultures. These differences matter for communication channel choices too. Less media-rich channels like email and text can be especially difficult for high-context communicators because subtle cues are stripped away. Cross-cultural interaction is not simply your culture versus my culture. It involves the complexity of the situation, the moral stakes, the emotions, and how people understand their own cultural habits and the other person's habits. In extreme situations, cultural differences can become more heated, not less, because stress narrows attention and increases defensiveness. Misunderstandings often come from semantics, because some words are not easily translatable. They come from connotations, because a word can carry different emotional meanings across languages. They come from tone differences, because what feels direct and efficient in one culture may feel rude in another, while what feels respectful and relational in one culture may feel evasive in another. They also come from differences in conflict tolerance and conflict resolution norms, and differences in what information people expect to share. So, what can you do to communicate more effectively across cultures? The best framing is collaborative, not managerial. Cross cultural communication is not you managing someone else's culture. It is two people collaboratively reconciling meaning through interaction, mutual understanding, and mutual learning. Before the interaction, it helps to know yourself, including your default assumptions, your typical communication style, and where you might be biased. It helps to foster a climate of mutual respect and fairness so people feel safe enough to clarify and repair misunderstandings. During the interaction, it helps to actively consider the other person's viewpoint, to slow down when ambiguity is high, and to treat misunderstandings as information rather than as evidence of incompetence or bad intent. After the interaction, it helps to reflect on what you learned, not just about the other person, but about your own communication habits, and to integrate those insights into how the group or relationship communicates going forward. In other words, cross cultural communication is not a one off skill, it is a learning process that builds cultural intelligence over time. As we end this video, let's summarize our discussion. Communication plays a major role in crisis response, ethical decision making, coordination, and trust. Most communication failures are not about bad intentions. They are about mismatches between message and channel, overload, anxiety, ambiguous meaning, or unexamined assumptions. In modern organizations, you can improve communication by being deliberate about mode choice, by considering synchronicity, by practicing active and reflective listening, by taking nonverbal communication seriously, by managing email and messaging norms to reduce overload, by recognizing and addressing communication apprehension, by communicating clearly through crisis stages, by using smartphones and social media mindfully with attention to well-being, by building a cybersecurity culture rather than relying only on technology, and by treating cross-cultural communication as collaborative meaning-making rather than as stereotype management. If you hold those principles, you will be a more effective teammate, a more effective leader, and a more effective organizational actor. Thank you for joining me for this discussion about communication. I hope you come back for further videos on organizational behavior.